Hi, I'm Joseph Komorowski. Today we'll be covering a mini lecture out of Hurley's Introduction to Logic text. We'll be in Chapter 2, um, Language, Meaning, and Definition. And today we'll be covering 2.1, Varieties of Meaning. So today there's three things that I'll present to you. One's a deeper understanding about reality, more broad. Secondly, a practical application to your own life. And thirdly, specific goals and objectives. I'm going to give you new terminology and the distinctions between these terms. So, for example, you'll understand cognitive versus emotive meaning, value claims, what they are, vague and ambiguous expressions, and then you'll know the difference between factual and verbal disputes. So that'll be the specific. But in order for you to appreciate those distinctions and new terminology, first, I'm going to start you off more broadly. And by the way, I use this text whether you're in my critical thinking class or my logic class for Chapter 2. And if you're not in any of those classes and you're just along for the ride, I hope you enjoy either way. So let's start with more broad. So here we are again. Chapter 2, Language, Meaning, and Definition. Let me start you in the beginning. Ordinary language, as most of us are at least vaguely aware, serves various functions in our day-to-day lives. The 20th century philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein thought the number of these functions to be virtually unlimited. Thus, among many other things language is used for, we could think of a whole bunch of reasons, but you can ask questions, tell stories, tell lies, launch verbal assaults, tell jokes, give directions, sing songs, issue commands, greet somebody. There's just an endless array of things that we can do. Hurley briefly mentions Wittgenstein. I want to go a little deeper, and here's why. He's pretty profound in the world of philosophy, more specifically analytic philosophy, and he went to Cambridge. He studied under a world-famous atheist, Bertrand Russell. In fact, that was his dissertation advisor. But, okay, why was he important? Well, he basically was the father of philosophy of language. So if you're going to think deeply about language, he was the person that really made this a huge movement in philosophy. And why would that be important, or why would that matter? So let's think super broadly now. Philosophy in its very basic form would ask questions like, what is reality? Like, what's out there? Or as I tell my 4-year-old son, what the hey is going on? Well, and then the second question is, how could you know about reality? Well, there's debate in the philosophical world broadly. You might get people starting off with metaphysics. Okay, well, what is reality? What's out there? Or somebody might start with epistemology or knowledge. Well, how could we know anything at all? Or somebody might start with logic. Well, let's start with arguments. Somebody might start with ethics. Let's start with wrong and right. Ludwig Wittgenstein, he says, well, let's start with language. Language is so messy. Just starting right there, when we ask the question like, what is reality, or how could we know? First, we have to get clear on the very language we use. Now, I think that's a pretty profound starting point. So, in the spirit of charity, I'm leaning against Wittgenstein, saying, yeah, he's got really something profound to add to this discussion about reality, right? So, I want to quote something from him. Everything can be thought at all can be thought clearly. Everything that can be said clearly. You might say, well, that's common sense, right? Well, he's going to say, it's Wittgenstein's claim here is not that we can string together words in unclear ways. Indeed, we do that all the time. Think about how sloppy some of our language is, the way we use it. We're trying to describe things to people. But he says, rather in doing so, we do not express anything that has any sense. What we say may get nods of approval from fellow speakers, and we may even be grasping at something important, but what we say does not convey anything meaningful. Wow. So he's slamming people who use language in a sloppy way. And again, what was the main broad goal here? We were trying to give a description of the world we live in. And he's going to say, yeah, but we might not be saying anything meaningful at all. So go back to the very title of this chapter, language, meaning, and definition. So Ludwig is going to say, look, if we have a bad starting point with our language and we're not even clear and very specific, as far as the words we use, we're not going to be doing anything meaningful at all. So this chapter is really going to start drilling in there. Well, let me finish with Ludwig here. I like this last quote. Whereof we cannot speak, we must remain silent. So unless you have a clear understanding with the words you use and you know what you're trying to say to somebody, maybe it's best just to remain silent and just say, look, I don't know. It's a good starting point, right? A lot of people think they know everything. And you might be sitting back like, man, this person is just talking and talking and talking. You might be getting that understanding in your mind when they're doing this and they're not conveying much to you at all. You might be thinking about Wittgenstein saying, look, maybe it's best not to speak about something you're unclear of. So that's more broad in a philosophical approach to reality. Like, where do we start? He's going to say, let's start with language. And, I agree. So now let's just think for a moment about critical thinking and logic in general. Logic's about the analysis of arguments. The analysis of an argument, an argument is built of premises and a conclusion, and if it's built the right way, the conclusion will be forced upon you, and you got to take that into your mind. Critical thinking is even more broad than that. You might say we have a set of beliefs that we hold, and how do you get those beliefs? Well, let me read you a critical thinking definition. Critical thinking is the intellectually disciplined process of actively and skillfully conceptualizing, applying, analyzing, synthesizing, evaluating information gathered from or generated by observation, experience, reflection, reasoning, communication as a guide to belief and action. I like this. As a guide to belief and action. So all the things we're doing in critical thinking and evaluating the words we use and the meanings and the language and the arguments, there's a bottom line for it. It's to guide our beliefs that we hold dear, right? And our action in reality. So you might say that's the bottom line of why you might be taking this class or even thinking about critical thinking or logic, is you want to do things better, right? You want to be more accurate. So in that sense, let me take you to a document. This was influenced to me by Frank Pistori. And again, we'll get to the very specific goals: cognitive, emotive, value, vague, ambiguous expressions. We'll get to that, but I want you to appreciate and have a deeper appreciation of what's going on before you actually get there. So, from Wittgenstein, we understand language is important. It's going to help us steer through reality, and then we get to critical thinking and logic, right? Well, now I want to specifically get to the beliefs you hold. This was inspired to me by a guy named Frank Pistori, fellow philosopher. Really smart guy, but I love how he breaks this down. This is going to have serious practical application for your everyday life. But he says people hold beliefs for three reasons: intellectual, emotional, and prejudicial. So in this section 2.1, we're really going to pull apart intellectual versus emotional, right? But I want you to have an understanding of these beliefs you hold for these reasons. So intellectual reasons, I think that. Emotional reasons, I feel that. Prejudicial reasons, I like that. So if a person holds a belief for an intellectual reason, they have evidence for why they believe what they believe, and they're willing to abandon the belief on the presentation of better evidence. wow, doesn't that sound like solid, common sense thinking? Like, wow, okay, that makes sense, right? Well, that's what's going on with critical thinking and logic. We're pursuing the intellectual reasons for why we believe what we believe. We're evaluating evidence. Okay. If a person holds a belief for an emotional reason, they do so apart from any conscious reflection of this kind of evidence that we just talked about. And they often manifest intense mental attitudes towards conflicting beliefs. We could think of somebody who's giving an intense mental attitude when we think of the abortion debate or cloning or life and death, like when people talk about capital punishment, or the immigration crisis at our border in the United States, right? Any one of these issues, people can get emotionally charged real fast, start slamming their fist down on the table. I hate that, or I love that. You might think that's leaning towards the emotional reason for a belief, right? You're either for or against abortion, or for or against cloning, or for or against immigration, any one of these issues, right? And you might have an intense mental attitude towards it. Most of us do, right? So, an example, Dodgers fans who don't want the facts to get in the way of their opinion. So somebody might come along and say, Dodgers suck. And you're like, what? And you start, getting full-blown mad. And then they say, not only do they suck, but here's why. And they start giving you facts, this, and that. How many of you think that when you're in the middle of a situation like that, you just start shutting down the conversation? You don't want to hear about facts and evidence. You just want to stay with the belief that you already hold for that emotional reason, right? And then last but not least, prejudicial reason, okay? So if a person holds a belief for a prejudicial reason, they have an adverse opinion against a position or person apart from any actual examination or investigation into the facts. These beliefs usually reduce to ad hominems, criticizing the man rather than the argument, like Christians are idiots or atheists are idiots, any way you go there, right? Another good way to think about prejudicial is, for example, let's say that you don't know anything about hockey, right? And a lot of your friends are Ducks fans. I happen to be a Ducks fan. Some of you are Kings fans, whatever. It depends what part of the world you live in, right? You may be Canadian. Say, look, I'm neither. But let's say you're not a fan of any particular team, but most of your family and friends are Ducks or Kings or, whatever fans. And you say, I don't really know much about them. I don't really have a feeling either way, but I'm going to become a Ducks fan. Why? Because a lot of my friends and family are fans. You might say you believe that the Ducks are a cool team or the Kings are a cool team, but you don't really have a feeling either way, and you haven't really examined any evidence or facts. You just lean that way, right? That's prejudicial reason, right? So why do I go to great lengths to spell these three out? Well, the point is, most people believe they hold their beliefs for intellectual reasons, when in fact they hold them for emotional or prejudicial reasons. This includes their religious beliefs, political beliefs. An example, Socrates thought it was his primary responsibility to help people come to know why they hold beliefs that they do, to bring these beliefs into the light of truth. So the practical application is this, and why it matters for chapter 2 is, for the focus of my entire class, whether you're taking logic, philosophy, critical thinking, it's to pursue intellectual reasons for your beliefs and to really push away these emotional and prejudicial reasons, because I want you to evaluate facts and evidence, arguments, and to think critically about the beliefs that you hold. Emotional and prejudicial, they have their place, but for right now, this is the primary focus of me teaching to you. And so that when somebody asks you, hey, why do you believe that? You don't give them an emotional reaction, or you don't say, well, because that's how I was raised, or well, that's what my family and friends do. Well, that's what everybody does. No. How about, oh yeah, I believe that because I really thought about it, and here's why. And you explain to them. So, okay, so broadly, we've covered Wittgenstein's application to philosophy of language and why language is important. And then we've, mapped out 3 reasons you might hold beliefs, and now I'm stressing the intellectual is the most important. And now we can finally get to the chapter and see when you get to Hurley making these distinctions, this will make a lot of sense. So right in the beginning, he says, compare these statements. He gives you 2 of them. Physician-assisted suicide, which is often confused with mercy killing, is always at the request of the patient and is legally permissible only with the patient's consent. Okay? That's one statement. Here's the second one. Physician-assisted suicide is a terrifying, intolerable practice in which doctors who are sworn to preserve human life end up destroying it by murdering their patients. Then he says, in what basic sense do these 2 statements differ? Well, in statement 1, it seems like we're giving you information, or the author's giving you information about physician-assisted suicide. And in the second one, it seems like somebody's trying to steer you using emotive language, right? Trying to tap into your emotions, trying to get you to think, look, physician-assisted suicide, it's bad. It's really, really bad. Why? Because they're using terms like terrifying, intolerable, destroying, right? Murdering. And, the bottom line of this chapter, again, is how we use our language, what kind of terms are we using, or what definition are we using, and what are the meanings behind these? Well, in statement 1, we're conveying information. Statement 2, we're doing something entirely different. So let's go down to, again, now the goals and objectives for this section is cognitive, emotive, value, vague, and ambiguous. And then, factual versus verbal disputes. Now we can finally give you some new terminology, right? So, all right. Terminology that conveys information is said to have cognitive meaning. Cognitive meaning, right? Cognitive meaning might have something to do with intellectual reasons for why you believe something, right? You believe something based upon information, facts, evidence, right? Versus emotive meaning. Something that expresses or evokes feelings is said to have emotive meaning, right? So then go back to this practical application, the emotional reasons, right? And there's a difference between the 2. So, thus in the first statement, the words legal, 31, most often, Virginia. Oh, that's right. Sorry, I didn't read this example up there. He's giving you 2 other statements similar to the 2 up here. This is physician-assisted suicide, and this one's about, I believe, the death penalty, okay? The first one's giving you fact-based. The second one's steering you with emotive language. And then he says, look, in the first one, words like legal, 31, most often, Virginia, record, they have primarily cognitive meaning. They're giving you information. While in the second statement, words like cruel, inhumane, hapless, drag, slaughter, bloodlust, vengeful, very strong emotive meaning. So when you hear a representation of factual based, information versus emotive, you say to yourself, well, if somebody wants to get me to believe something real fast, it could be that they don't care that I know about the information and the facts and the evidence. It could be that they just want to get me to believe it. Think about a politician. For those of you that don't care about politics, no problem, right? I believe that when you get older, you will, but here's one of the reasons why. This is profound common sense. What is politics all about? Power. What does a politician want? Power over you. This is why a politician runs for Senate, for Congress, House of Representatives, whatever, right? Or something local. Let's say you live in Southern California. They're running for a specific office because they want to have power so that they can make decisions for you. That's why you vote them into power, right? Now, you might say, well, if I describe it that way, somebody having power over you, you better hope that they know how to make decisions properly, right? So now it might be more disturbing when you think, hold on. So if somebody has power over me and they're making decisions for me because they think they can decide better than I can, and that's why they're in office and I'm not, what if they're trying to get me to believe a certain view and they're not giving me straightforward information and facts and evidence? What if they're undermining my intellectual capacity? And what if they're going straight into my emotions? What if they're doing it just to get my vote? Wow. Now that is reality, right? That's why I believe you should care more about politics and people that have power over you for this reasons. For this reason, um, you want to intellectually understand why they're doing what they do, and they may say, during a debate or something. And I'm not saying all politicians are like this. Some actually want to give you reasons and evidence and facts and convey information to you, right? Some hide behind that like a smokescreen, and they give you emotional reasons. They just want to tap into your emotions to get you excited or angry at a certain other candidate or a position, and they got your vote. And sometimes that's all people want to do. So without lingering in on that too much, you might say there's a huge reason for why this distinction is important in your own life. You might say you want to be guided by facts and information and not just feelings all the time. Some of you may have, you may be guided by emotions and feelings, and you may think something is really going on, but it's not. For example, you may be in a relationship where you think your spouse or your boyfriend or girlfriend, whoever, is cheating on you. And in your mind, you might think, it's happening, man. And you feel a certain way and you get pumped, your blood pressure is high and you're spiking and you get anxiety attacks. And you feel this way, right? You have this emotional reaction. And it could be that they're not cheating on you at all. And it's all in your own mind. There's another distinction. The fact is, they're not cheating on you, but you believe they are. So some of us have been steered that way. And when we finally come to realize, wow, you know what? Man, I'm emotionally charged. I'm getting worked up. I'm having these strong feelings. And it turns out maybe they're not mapping onto reality correctly. Maybe I should approach that person and say, hey, are you cheating on me? No, what would give you that idea? They're conveying information to you, right? So important distinctions. Value claim. A value claim is something that is good, bad, right, wrong, better, worse. Something more important than another. We all have values. You might hear this distinction between fact and value. Fact is, again, conveying information. Value claim is what ought to happen. What do you think is good versus bad, right? And this is a huge branch in philosophy associated with value claims called ethics. You might say, look, if you take an ethics class, you will learn about values. Where do they come from? What makes somebody's values more important than your values or societal values? One society might really value freedom. Another society might not. In one society, you might value eating hamburgers, right? Like cows. In another society, you might think that's totally immoral. So where do the values come from? That you might say, look, like now, that's not the primary focus of this chapter. But if you want to learn more about that, go take an ethics class. Very fascinating. But for now, just a distinction. Cognitive, meaning conveys information. Emotive, evokes feelings or emotions. Value claims will make judgments about right, wrong, actions, good and bad, character or people, better or worse. So whenever you hear these kind of trigger words, just know that you're talking about a value claim, okay? Good, bad, right, or wrong. So another distinction here we'll come to is a vague expression. And by the way, when I skim through this reading, if you're in one of my classes, I have already assumed that you've done the entire reading. This mini lecture is just supplementary, okay? But again, if you're not taking my class, who cares, all right? You're just listening to me talk and you're learning, which is good. But if you want more detail, you can read through a good critical thinking or logic textbook that talks about meaning, or a chapter on that. But for here, very powerful word coming at you, vague. Vague expression is one that allows for borderline cases in which it's impossible to tell if the expression applies or does not apply. Vague expressions often allow for continuous range of interpretation. So good vague word or normal vague words that can come up as love, happiness, peace, excessive, fresh, rich, poor, normal, conservative, polluted. They're all vague. What do you mean by that? Well, that is the question. When somebody, let's say you walk into a building and somebody says it's cold, and then somebody else might say, "Well, that's vague. What do you mean by cold?" And they say, "Oh, it's 40 degrees in here Fahrenheit." And they're like, "Oh, okay, that is cold." But until somebody gives you specific information about being cold, I mean, you might walk into a building and think 60 degrees is cold. Somebody else might think 30. Well, it's vague because you don't know if it applies, and it can give you a continuous range of interpretations until somebody comes along and gives you exact information. This is what I mean by cold. Oh, okay, that makes sense. So, or when somebody says, those poor people, you might say, yeah, those poor people. And somebody else might come along and say, what do you mean by poor? Like, what I think by poor is somebody who makes less than, $40,000 a year. And then somebody else might say that's doing the talking. Oh, no. What I mean by poor is less than $10,000 a year. Oh, okay. See, when you start throwing numbers out there, you're getting specific information, and you're going away from being vague. Now you're getting more precise. And the point of this vague expression is this: you want to not be vague when you're talking with somebody, especially when it's very important. Don't be vague. Be more precise in your language, because when you are vague, people might not understand exactly what you're trying to say. And if it's really important, you want them to understand. Okay. So let's avoid being vague. Ambiguous. So an ambiguous expression is one that can be interpreted in having more than one clear, distinct meaning in a given context. So at least two possible meanings, but it's not really clear what you mean when you are using a certain word, and somebody has to ask you, well, what do you mean by that? It's ambiguous. What they're saying is there's at least a couple different ways this could go. Which way do you mean? So Hurley gives you an example like light, proper, critical, stress, mad, inflate, chest. In fact, let me look to see. I think I have. Let me see here. Yeah, so here's a little PowerPoint. And what's the bottom line with vague and ambiguous statements? Well, in the beginning, I talked about cognitive meaning, one that conveys information. Well, this is the goal of critical thinking, right? But this can go defective in two different ways. So we want to convey information, facts, and give evidence for people when we're trying to persuade them of something in a good way with just facts, right? But that can go south, or it can be defective in two different ways. One is vague. Look, I'm not even sure that word applies at all. We saw rich, cold, hot, poor, things like that. Or ambiguous, a couple different meanings. And Hurley gives you an example. A light beer may be light in taste, color, or calories. There's at least three different possibilities of light. Which one do you mean? So again, this is ambiguous. Why does Hurley and why do I go at great lengths to stress this? Because I believe that people use these words vague and ambiguous a lot in language and in reality, and I don't really think it's clear to a lot of people what they actually mean when they use the words vague and ambiguous. For example, somebody may say that's vague and they really mean ambiguous, and somebody may say that's ambiguous and they really mean vague. So it's helpful to understand the difference between the two. Vague, does it apply or not? Does it have a blurred boundary, meaning, I'm not sure what you mean by cold. You're going to have to give me more information to specifically for me to realize if it's cold or not. Otherwise, it's just a vague word. Or is it ambiguous? There's multiple ranges of meaning here. Which one do you mean? So now that we got those distinctions on the board, we can understand, okay, so if we're trying to convey meaning and we understand that it can go defective or south in two different ways, if we can give more precise detail, we can avoid being ambiguous. We can avoid being vague, because that's the goal, okay? So let's go back. Let's go back to the chapter. I like to give this example, by the way, for ambiguous expression. Let's say my wife were to say, hey, Joseph, did you go you go by the bank and you go by the bank today to pay the bill. And I might say, yeah, I went by the bank today. And in my mind, I thought, oh my gosh, I forgot to go to the bank and pay the bill. So let's say I try to conjure up and I try to manipulate here using language. And I say, oh yeah, I drove by the bank today. And what I meant was riverbank. Because again, bank can have a few different meanings. One can mean a financial institution. The other one could be a piece of land by a river. So I tell my wife, yeah, I drove by the bank, and I'm actually, I don't want to be held responsible. So I equivocate. I know there's two different meanings going on. I choose one, and I'm like, okay, I got out of that one. And then she goes, oh, okay, that's good. You went by the bank. And then later on, she goes, I checked the bank account, Joseph, and you didn't pay that bill. And then I have to fess up and be like, okay, I didn't go by the bank today. So again, that's just a comical example. I'm not doing that with my wife. Why would this matter? Well, some people, especially in political debate, they are ambiguous on purpose. They are vague on purpose. They don't want to let you know exactly what they mean, because if they did that, they would lose support. They would lose votes, right? So they keep things ambiguous. They keep things vague. So you're not quite sure exactly what's going on, but you like them. They're cool. When they talk and they're trying to persuade you to vote for them, you're thinking, yeah, I'll vote for that person. All the while, you might think, I'm not really sure that bill even makes sense to me. It's kind of vague. What do you mean by I got more jobs for people? What do you mean by a job? And do you mean high paying? Do you mean low paying? Exactly my point, right? So again, when you're armed with these distinctions about cognitive meaning, emotive meaning, value claims, vague versus ambiguous expressions, now you can get more specific in the way you use language. You can become a better critical thinker in how you evaluate logic, or arguments in logic. So with these distinctions in mind, Hurley will say, as part of your homework that you may have, he'll say a verbal dispute, when two people are talking, a verbal dispute is a dispute that arises over the meaning of language. And in a verbal dispute, it's either going to be, you're going to have a term that's vague or ambiguous. That's a verbal dispute, right? A factual dispute is a dispute or disagreement about facts or information. So I will give you an example here. Oh, that's right. Let's go to my other text. Yeah, so let's go to number 3 here. Phil says, that was a great basketball game last night. Kobe Bryant scored 37 points. And by the way, bless his heart, I know he just died, with his daughter and the coach from, I believe it's Orange Coast College. It's just a horrible deal, and that sucks. And this example Hurley uses about Kobe Bryant, the great basketball player. So Phil's saying something about Kobe scoring 37 points. Author says your statistics are all wet. Bryant scored only 34 points. Hurley's going to ask you, hey, is this a verbal dispute or is this a factual dispute, or some combination between the two? And if you define factual just as a disagreement about facts, turns out that number 3, well, it's just a factual dispute. He either scored 37 or 34. Very straightforward information. You just look at the game or the aftermath of the game, you figure out, okay. He's either scored one or the other. It's not both at the same time, okay? So it's a factual dispute. Let's do another example. Let's do Vicky, number 2. Vicky, yesterday I visited the exhibition of the work of Jean-Michel Basquiat at Central Gallery. What an interesting artist he is. And then Barbara comes along, don't be ridiculous. That's not art. It's just graffiti. What kind of dispute do you think that is? Do you think that's over facts, or do you think that's over vagueness or ambiguity? Well, this is factual and verbal. So what do we mean by art? For example, Vicky's talking about art, and then Barbara's slamming it, saying that's not art. Well, okay, so it's now a vague term. What do you mean by art? You're gonna have to give me more specific information so I can understand, is it art or not art, to reduce vagueness. And then once we determine whether that's odd or not, then it becomes factual. So anyways, these are examples in possible homeworks that you might have, depending on whether you're using Mind Tap or the book. And you have to, figure out whether people are disputing over vagueness or ambiguity, which is verbal or just facts. And again, one of the bottom lines with this whole chapter, and specifically this section, is we want to use language in a more precise way and not in a sloppy way. And then we're hand in hand with what Ludwig Wittgenstein was after all along. If we want to describe or understand reality more and know why we believe what we believe, we got to really pay considerable attention to the language we use. We want to be more specific. And yes, let me go up to another section of a possible homework you could have. And this is the easy one. This section, written by George Wallace, Hurley's trying to say, hey, why don't you go through here and make a list of 25 highly charged words or phrases, again, intending to evoke a favorable or unfavorable attitude. What was that? Was that when somebody's doing that, are they trying to get you to understand more about cognitive meaning or emotive meaning when they're trying to elicit a favorable, unfavorable attitude? Correct. Emotive meaning. They're trying to elicit an emotive response. They might try to undercut your rational or your reasoning process and your rationality, right? Which is more along the lines of cognitive meaning. So let's scroll through here, see if we can find a few words that stand out that elicit an emotive response. Great principles of freedom. Maybe great, right? Seems like positive. Ooh, cruel irony. Cruel, is that good or bad? Well, that's bad, right? So it's eliciting an emotive response. Ooh, it's a fraud, sham, a hoax. Tragic. Insults. Destroys, right? Assassin's knife stuck in the back of liberty. So these are emotive. It's trying to use emotive language, and it's trying to get you to believe something. And what Hurley does in the beginning, he says, usually when people are using emotive meaning, they're trying to steer you into a certain value claim. They want you to believe that something's good, bad, wrong, or right. Now, there's a couple different ways of going that route. One is to give you factual information and let you decide for yourself whether that seems good, bad, right, or wrong. Another way of getting you there is to steer you emotionally, right? And we want, value claims they have their place in reality, right? We want to make sure that you get there in a more healthy fashion, thinking about evidence, facts, reasoning, versus just, I feel this way, right? And again, this goes back to that practical application I was telling you about earlier. We want to have beliefs about values, and again, we could use all kinds of different examples like cloning, abortion, stem cell research, immigration, Republican versus Democratic versus Independent Party. Any one of these can steer off value claims, good, bad, right, and wrong. We want to try to get there by using intellectual reasons and avoiding emotional and prejudicial. We want to know why we believe what we believe because we've evaluated the evidence. So, in a nutshell, I'd say for chapter 2, specifically this section 2.1, I've given you a few different distinctions in how you might use language, and I hope that you have a greater appreciation for why this is important. Furthermore, I hope that you would steer away from being vague or ambiguous when you're talking about matters that are important, okay? And you want to think about why you believe what you believe in a healthy manner. Again, you want to be steered and guided by reasons and facts and evidence. And then you can come about making a more healthy decision about reality, depending on what circumstance you're in. And that's about it. If you have any other questions, just let me know. And I hope you enjoyed today's mini lecture.